Hello and welcome to Vibrant Lives, a podcast, formerly Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast. This podcast is dedicated to health and well-being, featuring interviews with experts in the fields of nutrition, physical and mental health, and my 5-minute food facts series. I'm Amanda Hayes, your host. I'm a lawyer turned nutritionist, and I have a deep curiosity about living a healthy, active, and fulfilling life, which I would call a vibrant life, and sharing what I learn with you on this podcast. Before I introduce today's guest, I will mention that although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Vibrant Lives podcast is not intended to be used to treat or prevent injuries or medical conditions, and it is never a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today, I am here with Erin Niimi Longhurst, a British-Japanese author whose work has been featured in the BBC, Vogue, Stylist, El Mundo, and El Vietnam. She is also the author of 2 gorgeous books. The first is Japonisme, Ikigai, Forest Bathing, Wabi-sabi, and more. It explores the Japanese art of finding contentment through practical tips and tricks to live a healthier, happier, and more thoughtful life. Her second book is called Omoiyari, and it is about the Japanese art of compassion. I absolutely adore Erin's books, not only for the content, but also for the presentation. So it is my great pleasure to chat with Erin today about her books and what we can learn from the Japanese culture. Hi, Erin. It's a real pleasure to have you with me today on Vibrant Lives podcast. So, Erin, you describe yourself as British Japanese. You grew up with a Japanese mother and an English father. To me, that sounds like a wonderful gift because you have the insight into 2 cultures. But more importantly, I'd like to hear about what that was like for you. So, where did you spend your childhood?
So, my father is English and my mother is Japanese, but my father worked for the Foreign Office, so I'd move a lot every few years, really. I was born in the UK and then lived in Seoul, South Korea until I was about 2. And then after that, I lived in Japan for several years. So until I was about 9, where my mother is from as well.
Mm-hmm.
So very close by to my Japanese relatives who are mostly based around Tokyo. And then when I was around 10, I moved to New York as my father was working for the UN.
Mm-hmm.
So I, would spend obviously a lot of time in the cultural melting pot that was New York, but
great.
I would go back to Japan every summer, every winter. So kind of all over the place, but
yes,
between Japan, the US and the UK.
Yeah, that explains your accent to me. We lived in Hong Kong for several years, and people there have this. It's almost like a combination of UK, US. It's a sort of an international accent, and that's
the
how
international school accent.
It is very much so. And where are you living now, Erin?
I'm currently living in London. So I'd actually moved back to New York a year ago, and then COVID hit, and I made the decision to move back to the UK. But my mother currently lives in Honolulu, and my extended family are, as I mentioned, in Tokyo.
Right. Okay. So, Erin, do you feel more aligned to one culture than another, or does it depend a bit on where you are?
It's a really interesting question, and something I've been thinking a lot about this week in particular. I think there's been a lot of, particularly out of the US, a lot of talk about this, anti kind of Asian sentiment and how I kind of fit into that. And I really feel strongly tied to my Japanese heritage. My mother, we speak Japanese together. We actually, she used to pretend she didn't speak English, so I would, learn, I would be more fluent. But I've always found myself in the role of translator, whether it was kind of translating things for my Japanese relatives or doing the same for my British relatives. So I feel very much culturally both English and Japanese, but kind of, so not necessarily more than one over another. And I think that's kind of what led to a lot of what I started writing about, which really is about bringing it to, one culture really into another. So it also does depend on where I am. I think when I'm in Japan, I dream more in Japanese and I sleep talk more in Japanese. But I not necessarily aligned to one culture. I definitely feel strongly that I have roots in both.
Oh, that's wonderful. I like the sound of that. Do you consciously or unconsciously make adaptations when you're in a certain place? So, for example, the way you dress or the way you speak, does that change depending on who you're with, either your Japanese family or your English family or friends?
I think I do. I know I perhaps don't see it in myself as much, but I have a younger sister who is just a year younger than me. And when she's in Japan or speaking in Japanese, she's a lot more reserved and maybe a bit more shy than she is usually. So while I don't necessarily see it in myself, I'm sure I do the exact same thing and adapt depending on the context.
Yeah, I'm sure it's just something you're so used to doing, you may not even notice that you do it. Erin, your last name is Niimi, is it your middle name or your last name?
So my parents aren't married. So my mother's last name is Niimi and my father's last name is Longhurst. So I have both. So when I'm in Japan, all my documents are, Niimi Erin. So that's my Japanese last name.
Okay. And what does it mean?
So the characters mean new and beautiful. So you use the first character when you're describing something that's new, or atarashi is the word, but the character itself, when it's in the context of my name, is pronounced like ni, and mi means beautiful. So the characters of my Erin, which is my name in Japanese as well, kind of mean are the characters for England, but also bell, like a ringing bell.
So Erin, you're an author. You've written 2 books, and I'd love to talk about them. And I'll just paint a bit of a picture, a bit of background for our listeners. So the Japanese culture is obviously an ancient one with deep traditions, and it has many rituals that pertain to aspects of daily life. And I think from reading your books and other books about Japan, many of the Japanese customs are like potential antidotes, I think, to our hyper busy, crazy consumerist lifestyle. And examples might be the tea ceremony or taking time to clean your home and keep it organized. And we know a lot more about that because of Marie Kondo, of course. So your 2 books you've written help us learn from Japanese culture and traditions and apply those to our daily life. Your first book is Japonisme, which was published in 2018, and I believe it was published as the Little Book of Japanese Contentments in the US. And your second book is Omoiyari, which was published last year. So, Erin, what inspired you to write these books?
I think what really drew me to write the books really came from a desire to want to share these practices and traditions that I grew up with. The whole process really started because I had begun writing a travel and sort of lifestyle blog about my time in London. And as I was writing it, I'd start sharing recipes, and a lot of what I would share were, drawn from things my mother cooked for me growing up, or things that I learned from my Japanese grandfather and my grandmother, who, would do calligraphy. And for me, it was second nature and what I grew up with and seemingly quite obvious. But over time, there was a lot of interest in the things I was writing about, and actually a publisher to reach out to me and say, we're looking to commission a book about Japanese lifestyle and what people might be able to bring in their own lives. And would you be interested in writing it? So that's how Japonism sort of came about. And in many ways, that was a much easier book to write. I think it had, had years to kind of material really to draw on from my blog. And I think the second book, Omoiyari, which originally was supposed to launch around the time of the Tokyo Olympics, which unfortunately was postponed because of the pandemic. That was a lot more challenging for me to write because I think I didn't have the kind of years of thoughts and ideas and materials that I had had for the first. But that's really kind of what inspired me to share it, is this interest that people had in traditions and things that I kind of grew up with.
Yeah, I think your second book, Omoiyari, is perhaps a little bit more subtle. I'm not sure that some of the concepts in there. But anyway, we will talk about each of your books. But before we do, I just wanted to ask you about the illustrations because they are so beautiful. They're done by Ryo Takamasa. So how did that collaboration come about?
So with the books, it was really important to me that we incorporate, really strong visual elements to really bring the subject matter to, visually to a wider audience. And I think it was really important that we had an illustrator that was Japanese, and very kind of stylistically, in many ways, the illustrations are so simple but so beautiful. They, that was a kind of collaboration that came around really from my publishers, but it was really important for me that we kind of had a Japanese illustrator involved in that process. And I think, I absolutely love his work, and I'm so, happy that we've been able to collaborate.
The illustrations really are beautiful, and I'll also say that the paper the books are printed on is lovely. It's thick, and it just looks so and feels so nice to touch and hold. It'd be nice as a coffee table book, just putting it out there. So let's talk about Japonisme. So what does that term mean?
So the title really comes from a term that is used in art, and it was really used to describe this kind of Western appreciation and fascination with Japanese culture. And I think when we were trying to come up with a name for the book and the title for the first book, it was around the time when all these other concepts were coming out kind of globally. So, in sort of Scandinavia and, Hygge and all these things. And because there are so many different concepts and they're so varied, I guess, in Japanese culture, we decided on this title because it really, to us, kind of encapsulated this appreciation and, I guess, admiration for Japanese culture. And that's essentially how we landed on it. So it's not necessarily the correct dictionary definition of the term, but for me, it's really about an appreciation of Japanese art and culture and lifestyle. And
I mean, that's how I read it. I think it's a French word. I'll double check this. And as you said, Claude Monet was very interested in Japanese art and prints. And if you go to his place in Giverny, his house is full of Japanese artwork. So yes, I think there was a real appreciation, or still is, always has been, for Japanese art. So how did you structure the book? Can you give us a bit of an overview of Japonisme and how it's set out?
Definitely. So again, when I was thinking about how to describe all these different sort of, because we have practices, but also philosophies and concepts within it. And the way I decided really to describe it was to divide the book into 3 parts. So the first is really about bringing these philosophies and practices. So things like wabi-sabi, which is kind of celebrating and finding beauty in imperfection. And those kind of philosophies aren't necessarily, they're more of a mindset.
Yes.
And so I wanted to talk about sort of kokoro, which is a term that means kind of the heart and the mind. And, it's not this kind of mind, body, spirit separation. It's sort of all in one. So that is the first section of the book. The second, which we call karada, which is body. And so really ways in which you can embody some of these philosophies and practices. And the second part of the book is very much more practical, I think, than the first. So these are things that you can do. So forest bathing, flower arranging, cooking. And so the reason I structured it that way is because I wanted it to be things that you can do, and physically embody some of the philosophies that I introduced in the first section. And then the third is Kaizen, which is habit forming. So how you can continue and make things, I guess, persevere.
Yes, I'd like to just dive into a couple of things in a little bit more detail. So Kintsugi, so as an art form, what is it?
So Kintsugi is really tied to the art of tea ceremony. And so tea ceremony really is about harmony, beauty, tranquility, and respect. And it's also really tied to this wider philosophy of wabi-sabi and finding beauty in imperfection and how things change over time, and not to necessarily fight against it, which I think is very instinctive in some societies, but to find beauty in the stillness and mindfulness in that moment. And so what Kintsugi is, it's a way of repairing broken ceramic using golden lacquer. So while, again, I'm English, we have afternoon tea here. And if you have a tea set, I think, in Western or like British culture, if you have a chipped teacup, it might be considered to be imperfect and therefore discarded or set aside or seen as not desirable. But in Japanese tea ceremony, having a teacup that has some kind of blemish or imperfection or scar, or in this case, something that's been fixed, and that, I guess, imperfection is highlighted by the golden lacquer, and it's drawn kind of attention to it. And I think that's kind of reflective of a wider appreciation of, finding beauty and acceptance in what has come before. And so that's why I think I wanted to kind of bring it, forward. And I think it's, since I wrote the book, there's been a lot more talk and interest in sort of sustainability. And I think it is a really valuable lesson of, things do have a use beyond, if it does break, you can fix it. And so that is what I wanted to kind of bring that philosophy across.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for people who grow up in this consumerist society that we live in, to try and understand and appreciate, life isn't perfect, so why should everything around us be perfect? What are some of the ways, Erin, that you apply Kintsugi in your daily life?
I think one way is physically, I have a Kintsugi set, and I think you also might have.
I've ordered one from Etsy to fix my favorite coffee mug.
And so I think it's just about, I guess, giving things a second chance in many ways, but also that applies to yourself as well. I think a lot of what makes you who you are comes from what's come before, and there's, often pain, and, I think everyone has things in their past that they'd like to address or change. But it's about finding strength from that. And it's, of course, more challenging for some than others. But I think that is one way of finding kind of beauty and imperfection, and finding lessons where, you might not have been able to find them before. And then also, I think, as I mentioned, giving things and objects a second chance. So in my second book, and I know we'll get onto it in a moment, but I have a whole chapter on a concept called mottainai, which is, having this, not wanting to waste anything and wanting to preserve something. And I think I'm a really big believer in, leftovers, or, if I make a broth of some kind, like what can I use that for in other dishes to bring that forward? And I think it's just about being and showing more respect to not only yourself, but your environment around you and the objects that you have. I think we are increasingly, unable to deny things like, the resources we have in the world. And it's more important than ever to, where we can,
I know
our...
the resources are finite and we need to be very conscious of that. But it sounds like being sustainable and resourceful are very much embedded deeply into the Japanese culture. It's something that you would do as a matter of course. One of the other concepts you talk about is Shukanka. So this is about the Japanese approach of forming habits that you did touch on before. And there's a proverb that you quote in there, which I really love. And it says, beginning is easy, continuing is hard. So what are some of the ways, Erin, that you've observed Japanese people forming habits? Like, how do they do that in Japan?
A lot of what I wrote about was really inspired by my Japanese grandfather. So he was a very successful businessman, but in addition to that, at the weekends, he would go, he had a house in the countryside and was also a sort of temple elder, and in many ways would do things that I don't, you never see them in these kind of like CEO profiles you see out of Silicon Valley. He would like sweep the temple floors. From him, I really learned, I guess, mindfulness and how important it is. Every school child in Japan will learn how to read and write because they have to repeat, a series of prescriptive characters every single day. So it's kakijun, it's like the order of strokes and how you write things. And with that, it's about really small changes that happen over a really long period of time, rather than, this kind of extreme, like cramming something on the day before. And I felt that is such an important thing to take away, because one, it's about practicing patience and, being, respectful and not too sort of harsh on yourself. But, it's about just the small incremental changes over a really long period of time that can really make sort of dramatic changes. And with that and habit forming, I definitely kind of learned a lot from my Japanese relatives. So, my grandfather was very into, he had a very small garden, but was tended to it really, little and often. And I like to think that I now do the same sort of things. I think I like to do things incrementally over a really long period of time. And that's the only way for me that anything's ever stuck.
I really like that example of your grandfather, because whilst he might have had a high-powered job, he still took the time to do those tasks that some people might think are menial, like sweeping the gravel at the temple, and that it's a sign of mindfulness, as you say, and respect for everyone else that goes to the temple. And I think, to me, it sounds like it also keeps one's ego in check, because it's paying attention to every aspect of your life, not just, your job. So I really like the sound of that.
Definitely. And I think one thing is, so that you get it in the art of sort of flower arranging as well. And it's not, with flower arranging, you don't necessarily, it's not prescriptive. You don't go in with like, these are the flowers I'm going to arrange and this is how I'm going to do it. Like, you let the process organically come to you. And a lot of, famous Japanese like army generals practice flower arranging, which I don't really see that in any other context. But I think doing that really brings people's attention to where they are in a specific moment in time, but also, you know, the time of year and what's going on in the world around you. And I think those types of mindful activities can really bring a lot of benefit.
And it keeps you tied in with the real world, doesn't it? Instead of being too focused on your work or your army career or whatever it is. It takes you outside that and makes you appreciate the small but important things like beautiful flowers and nature and things like that. Erin, your second book, Omoiyari, The Japanese Art of Compassion, which is a gorgeous title. You say right up front in the book that Omoiyari is very difficult to define, and I guess there's no direct English translation for that. So could you give us a description of what it means?
Omoiyari for me is really about acting with empathy and sort of preemptively acting with empathy, but in a way that is, I guess, inherently selfless, because a lot of these moments of omoiyari that you see in Japanese culture don't have a specific individual or person in mind. It's often an abstract person, you know, might be like someone who is using the space in the future.
Yes.
That you might not know, and they're not necessarily, you know, a customer or anything like that. And it was such an interesting concept for me to try and articulate and translate. And one of the ways that I did it was asking people who had been to Japan and had experienced it to share their stories, to really bring some of these things to life. But one example that I talk about early on in the book is around the World Cup. So Japan were playing against Colombia, and it was this, you know, surprise sort of upset because Japan won, and it was an away game. And actually, after their victory, the Japanese fans stayed behind to clear up the stadium behind them. And I think that, for me, just so clearly articulates what the concept is about. And it's about, okay, respect for the space around you and for others. And I think in many ways in Japan, it comes out of necessity. It's such a densely populated and rather small country. And so that kind of cultural aspect, I think, maybe does, you know, spring from necessity. But I think it is really important to respect each other and act kindly towards each other. Yes. I think sometimes, you know, I think increasingly divisive the world we live in. And I think for me, it's like a way to, you know, try and encourage empathy and kindness and compassion in others.
And harmony. I think we all have to remember that we live as part of a society. Being kind and respectful, I think, makes things work a lot more easily. So, Erin, you gave the example of the soccer match. I really loved that because, as you said, that was a very clear illustration of what the concept means. How do you practice it in your daily life?
This is a really interesting question, because I also, one of the things that I really think in the book, you know, a lot of the traditions and practices and concepts I talk about, for example, like calligraphy or tea ceremony, and my family are essentially, you know, have spent decades of their lives training in these subjects. And I've got a very, in many ways, kind of surface understanding of kind of all of them. But it's really about, as we kind of said before, like habit forming and practice, but also trying to find that balance. I think in the first book, I talk about ikigai, which is the concept meaning kind of purpose. And people get it from, you know, their family or their home or their work. And it's the kind of intersection of all these different facets of our life. And then with Omoiyari, I think it's about acting for compassion to others, but also to yourself as well. We're still in lockdown here in London, and it's been, you know, incredibly hard. And I've really found the last few months really challenging. And then one of the things I think, trying to think with kind of these feelings of respect, not only to, you know, myself, and I was trying to figure out what I was missing recently in my life. And I kind of found that actually one of the things I do get a lot of inspiration and energy from is, giving back to the community and volunteering. And I found being in, trying to be safe and not having contact with people, it's really challenging to do that. But in the last week, I found there's a local, community building group.
Mm-hmm.
And I, was like, okay, what am I missing at the moment? And I was like, I think I'm missing like giving back and talking to people that aren't just, people I work with or my friends, I guess really connecting, as we mentioned before, like to the real world. And, I was really exhausted, had a really long day at work. And I think reaching out and just being like, I'm really looking to volunteer and give back. And we had kind of I joined one of those kind of neighborhood voluntary kind of community meetings, and I found it so valuable. And I was like, this is what I was missing. And I just need to, practice finding that balance and taking a step back and looking at like, what part of my life am I missing at the moment? And sometimes it's as easy as, I think my home needs addressing and I need to fix, various things in the house, or I need to be eating more vegetables this week, or, going out for a walk more. But, having that kind of sense of empathy and compassion to yourself as well. Like don't talk to yourself like you're being mean, like talk to yourself like you talk to your friends. And I think that's one of the ways that I've been trying to practice.
So what I'm hearing is kindness, really. Kindness to yourself, kindness to others, thinking about others. Following on with that theme, one of the chapters in your book is polite conscientiousness, which is exactly the kind of thing you've been describing. And the way some people practice that in Japan is through things like tea ceremonies and punctuality and the presentation of gifts. So tell me about the presentation of gifts.
Yeah, so the chapter is called Tene. So it's doing things, I guess, with purpose and intention and to the best that they can be. I think that's what Tene means. It's about paying attention to detail and doing things properly and not taking the shortcut. And I think it's really, again, tempting to just try and take the easy route and, just go on a crash course juice cleanse or, whatever it might be. But Tene is about doing things with thought, but paying attention to the details. And I think one aspect in the book is really about, gift giving and the presentation of gifts. So I share a technique of, how to wrap gifts, and tea ceremony, I think, is really about Tene and doing things with precision and, doing things deliberately. And when you're engaging in a tea ceremony, the host will have thought about, everything, like the number of guests, what time of year it is, what calligraphy they're going to have on the wall, what flower arrangement they're going to serve with it. And I think that is a way of, these paying attention to these little details. It just, you can appreciate beauty more when you practice it, I think. And you can see it in others as well when you approach your own life in that way. So the kind of politeness and respect towards each other, I think, is one of the things that I wanted to bring across.
And it also demonstrates great generosity, not just in terms of giving a gift or inviting friends over for a tea ceremony, but really devoting your time to other people. Because as you say, doing things deliberately, it takes a lot more effort to wrap a present really beautifully than just to quickly shove it in a bag or something. So I think people must appreciate all of that and recognise the care and attention that's been given. The other thing that I really loved reading about, because I've seen them around but never really understood the meaning behind them, was the 1,000 paper cranes, senbazaru. So in Japanese culture, what is the crane a symbol of?
A crane, which I actually hadn't thought about really until I kind of sat down to write, but they mate for life. So it's really about fidelity, and I guess, they also live a long life. So there's a proverb that is, a crane lives for 1,000 years, which obviously isn't true, but that's kind of to demonstrate, how long and sustained their lifespans are. So I think it's about commitment and love and, things
Weathering the storms
enduring.
together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Something that's really enduring. And the 1,000 paper cranes is something that you make with origami, which is the art of, folding paper
Yes.
in a decorative way. Yeah, I think senbazuru means 1,000 of these. And the amount of dedication and persistence it takes to sit and fold them, again, it's a commitment, but it's also a physical embodiment of appreciation or goodwill. And so people are often given these at weddings, or if someone is unwell.
If you are giving someone some cranes, do you always have to give them 1,000 at one time, or can you give them a few cranes, or how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, you can just give them a few cranes, but I think the 1,000, it just has a very specific connotation. It's like just having such good will or wishing good fortune on someone. And so I think it's just like a really extreme example of that kind of appreciation that you have for someone that you have done.
So
this.
it's
And
like
I think
the ultimate gift, say, at a wedding, 1,000 paper cranes. Have you ever done it yourself?
I've done it as part of like a as in like as a family or as like a school, when I was younger. A friend I went to primary school with, unfortunately had a brain tumor. So our class kind of sat and folded them together because we all wanted her to get better. And thankfully she was okay. And I actually had started at the beginning of lockdown. So the first sort of worldwide lockdown, I was in New York, where I was working, and my partner was supposed to have moved out there and he wasn't able to. He's a doctor, but wouldn't have been able to practice out in the US because he's trained in the UK. And around that time, I started making, like folding them, because it was something to do. And it just, every single crane, I was like thinking about a certain person when I was, a different person when I was creating it. So I didn't quite get to 1,000 because I had to eventually move, but I ended up moving back to London. But it was something that I found really comforting, actually.
Yes. So do you find it quite a relaxing process?
Yeah, I do. I think it's I've just been folding cranes since I was really tiny, so something that it comes sort of second nature to me.
Second nature. And it makes me think of when I was growing up watching my grandmother. She used to knit socks all the time, and she just was always with her knitting needles doing it. She didn't even need to look. She just did it. So maybe it's a bit like that. You've done it so many times that you just know your body knows what to do, or your hands know what to do. And Erin, there was one thing I was thinking about when I was preparing some questions for you. I was thinking, I wonder if almost the reverse case could work. If a book about Britishness and British culture, do you think anyone in Japan would be interested in such a book? I'm just curious.
I definitely think so. I mean, because when my books have come out, my Japanese relatives have bought, even though they don't necessarily read English, they've, been very supportive of it. And that is always their first question, is like, when are you going to write a book about British culture and Britishness in Japan? And it's so interesting to me because I think the Japanese culture was easier for me to write about because Japan was so isolated, I guess, from the rest of the world for such a long period of time. And England, and particularly London, where I live, is such a melting pot of cultures that I think my experience would be a very slim reflection of what actually British culture is really like. But I'd love to, do something about my own experience as well, I think.
Oh, that's a really good point, because the The Japanese culture it's really unique, isn't it? Whereas, as you say, the UK is a melting pot. I was thinking along the lines of things like the British afternoon tea and the stiff upper lip and, those kind of images you have or one has about British people and British culture.
Yeah. I mean, but I'd love to do a book about afternoon tea and like a
Yeah.
roast dinner and,
All
you know,
those things, I know.
I-
You do a lot of things apart from writing your books. You work at a digital agency, is that correct?
Yeah, so I was actually the first person that started working at that agency almost 6 years ago now. But we help organizations that have a social good purpose, so
Hmm.
mostly charities and nonprofits, on how they can better tell stories online and do things like fundraising. And
Sure.
it's been so interesting because I've done a lot of soul searching, I guess, the past few years, because I do get so much value from my work because of the organizations that I work with. But I think writing as well as can be a full-time job in itself. And I've got a really good balance now in which I work part-time with them, and then part-time I can pursue my writing and all these other opportunities that I'm really lucky to be able to take the time to pursue. But really enjoy my work. I think it's very varied, and I really just love working with the types of organizations that I
Yeah.
do. So at the moment, I'm working with, the UNHCR, which is the High Commission for Refugees, and, these charities in the UK that are combating domestic abuse and those types of, I do get a lot
Yeah.
of my energy and enthusiasm
Yeah.
from
So
that
important
work as
social
well.
issues. And I mean, these days, the reality is people need to know, or organizations need to know how to use social media to their benefit because that's how they reach people. So I believe you're also a trained private chef.
Yes. So it was actually one of those things where this was always a dream of mine. And I decided a few years ago to, because I was
Hmm.
always a keen cook at home, but I wanted to get
Yeah.
that sort of formal training and formal qualification. And I signed up to go, part-time culinary school, evenings and weekends and the week before I started, I got an email from my publisher being like, would you be interested in writing a book? So when I was writing the book, I was, working full time in the
Oh
evenings,
my
going to culinary school,
goodness.
and then like just really random hours writing my book. But I really love cooking. I think for me, it's meditation. For me, I just love it. And I before all this was able to do things
Yeah.
like supper clubs
Well,
and
hopefully
things like
you'll
that.
be able to
So
do that
hopefully one
again.
day.
Do you like cooking all
Yeah.
different types of cuisine, or are you more drawn to Japanese style food? Or
Well, the reason I decided to do this culinary school, and again, it's, very traditional
Mhm.
kind of French cuisine, I suppose,
Yeah,
is what I'm trained in. But at home, I always, my mother was the cook growing up, and I always made Japanese food. And that's what and I think my partner is always, I think he's eating a lot more Japanese, Asian food now that we live together. But that's what I grew up with, and
yeah,
I know how to cook that. Like, but it was all the stuff like, roast potatoes or like a roast dinner and that kind of traditional Western food that I didn't really have as much confidence in doing. And so I wanted to go to culinary school to learn essentially,
yeah.
Western cooking. But I do really enjoy all different types of cuisine. A very good friend of
Oh,
mine
yeah.
is a Lebanese chef, and I think from him I've learned so many amazing recipes. And I have so many cookbooks. I My partner didn't quite understand until we moved in together. I had about 6 boxes. Everything I moved from New York, yeah, all fit into 6 boxes. 3 of those were cooking implements. Two of those were cookbooks or just other books, and there was only one box for clothes. And he was just like, I was like, we're going to need a few bookshelves, and I don't think he fully realized until my stuff
Well,
arrived.
he's
He was like,
very
I
lucky.
see. Um,
Um, and you're also a Muji brand ambassador, is that correct?
Yes, I've been so lucky with them because Muji is a brand that I grew up with in Japan. I've always had their, bath salts and pajamas. And when Omoiyari came out, they were really supportive of the book, and they wanted to kind of do a promotion with the book in their stores, which was incredible because, they don't sell books really. And that led to kind of this partnership. So I help promote and collaborate on some of their product range, which really fits in with a lot of the themes that I cover.
There's a lot of things in Muji that are wonderful for around the home, and every time I go in there, there's something that I never knew that I needed. Erin, to wrap things up, who inspires you?
I think growing up, as I mentioned, I was really inspired by my Japanese grandfather. I think I get a lot of my work ethic from him, and a lot of the ways I unwind and relax, I think I've pretty much just carbon copy. But day to day, I think my mother, we're really close. We speak a lot all the time, and she's really an incredible person. She was a, single mother, and she's very brave, and also kind of inquisitive, and also a very keen foodie as well. So that is, I guess, a person that they kind of
wonderful.
inspire me.
The final question I'd like to ask is one that I ask all of my guests. And if you could recommend 2 things that all people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be? They can be anything at all.
That's such a good question. One thing that I'm a true believer in is having a cup of tea, but in a very ritualized way, I suppose, is how I'd put it. So, I have a whole chapter on tea ceremony. But I think, and the same is true necessarily with coffee. And I think one thing that I think we all do too much of, and I'm guilty of this myself, is, you drink tea or coffee because you want that immediate caffeine hit. But the benefit of a true coffee break comes from detaching and unwinding and taking your mind off of something. So if there is a way that you don't do it in a rushed way, have get your favorite cup out and make it, take the time, do things slowly. I think it's such a benefit. And I think, a lot of people I know are working from home at the moment, and I essentially, invested in really nice cup and saucer set, and it's such a silly thing in many ways, but it's just taking small breaks. So that is the first, and then the second is really forest bathing, or shinrin-yoku, which is what I talk about in the book. And one of the only things we can do at the moment in London anyway, or in the UK, is our daily walk. And shinrin-yoku really is about going for a walk and immersing yourself in nature, but in a way that isn't following a set path. You're not you're going there for a purpose. It really is just to go and, immerse yourself in nature and take in some of the natural phenomena that's around you. So I do talk a lot about these different words that don't have a direct translation, but komorebi is one of my favorite words, which is the light that filters through the leaves in a tree.
So you're saying go into the forest or nature and just notice it and be present, and not necessarily going there to go for a walk or do your exercise. Or, I guess that could be part of it, but it's more about noticing your surroundings.
Yeah. And I'm just going in, I guess, without a necessarily intent or purpose. And, I have recently started, running a lot more, and that's very different for me than going and just, appreciating and taking in the natural surroundings. And I think it's been so important, now more than before, just have that connection. So I think those would be my 2 kind of things that I would suggest people can do to. Yeah.
And what's your favorite tea? Do you have a favorite tea?
So if I'm having it with milk, it's Yorkshire tea. My British family have strong Yorkshire roots, so that is my, builder's tea, as you say here. But my
Yes.
Japanese tea is hojicha, so it's like a roasted green tea, and that's my favorite.
Is that the one with the roasted rice grains in it, or is that a different one?
No, that's genmaicha.
Oh, yes, I love that one.
Which is also really,
Yeah. So, Erin, if someone listening to this podcast would like to follow you or see what you do, what's the best way for them to do that?
So I have a website, which is erinniimilonghurst.com. So Niimi is Niimi, which is always really confusing for people when I'm giving it over the phone to do whatever. And then I'm very active, I think, on Instagram. So at Erin Niimi, one word, and also the same handle on Twitter as well.
Great. I'll put links to all of that in the show notes. And thank you so much for chatting with me today, Erin. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. It was really, I just enjoyed so much hearing your perspective on your books and why you wrote them. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that was the very lovely and accomplished British-Japanese author Erin Niimi Longhurst, sharing her insights into aspects of Japanese culture that bring contentment and good health. Thank you for listening today. I hope you found today's interview interesting or inspiring. If you did, please share the podcast with your friends. And if you could take a minute to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, it will help people find my podcast. Please follow me on Instagram at vibrant_lives_podcast. Also, feel free to DM me or contact me via my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com. You can go to the contacts page there. And if you'd like to suggest topics you'd like to learn more about or people you'd like to hear me interviewed, I will do my best to deliver that to you. If you enjoy my podcast and would like to support it, you can visit the donate page on my website, or you can go to the bookshop page on my website. If you click the Amazon link in my bookshop, at no extra cost to you, I receive a small commission when you buy a book, so I'd be very grateful if you decide to do that. Thank you so much for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.